People around the world picture New Zealand as a pristine, remote paradise. But right now, for thousands of its own citizens, the reality looks a lot more like a crowded airport departure terminal. In the single year leading up to August 2024, nearly 74,000 citizens packed up and left the country. For an island nation of just over 5 million people, that is a staggering outflow. And they aren't scattering across the globe. More than 58% of these emigrants are catching a 3-hour flight west across the Tasman Sea, relocating directly to Australia. Kiwis moving to Australia is a historical norm, practically a cultural rite of passage. But the sheer volume we're seeing right now breaks all previous historical records. In a country of only 5 million, losing that many people in a single year changes the math of the workforce. Every departure is a lost taxpayer, a consumer gone from the local economy, and a hole in the community that isn't being filled. If you read the local headlines, this exodus is usually framed as a classic brain drain. The story goes that Australia is aggressively poaching New Zealand's brightest and most highly educated professionals. That is certainly happening in healthcare. Roughly 40% of New Zealand's domestically trained doctors leave for Australia within a decade of graduating, leaving the remaining staff to demand safe patient ratios and better pay. Australian state governments are even targeting New Zealand police officers. Queensland launched a campaign offering starting salaries of around $110,000, plus a $22,000 relocation bonus, just to make the move. But the departure data reveals a profile that's expanding. Retail workers, tattoo artists, and fresh graduates are joining those specialists at the gates, moving in volumes usually reserved for the high-skilled elite. This migration has moved beyond a surgical extraction of top-tier talent. So, what exactly is failing inside New Zealand to drive out so much of its broader working class? Researchers at the New Zealand Treasury noticed this shift. When they dug into the migration data, they concluded that the country was experiencing something different from a typical brain drain. They called it a same drain. The people leaving now perfectly represent a cross-section of New Zealand's entire demographic and skill makeup, from laborers to managers. And these average citizens are being pushed out by structural economic realities. New Zealand is dealing with persistently stagnant domestic wages, running head-on into a severe, years-long housing crisis. On the ground, this means fully employed young professionals are putting their weekly grocery runs on buy now, pay later apps just to survive until their next paycheck. New Zealand cities are hollowing out. Favorite restaurants are closing and streets are quieting down. People aren't abandoning their culture because they want to. They are leaving because they simply cannot afford to stay. This chart shows average weekly earnings for full-time employees in both countries. Notice how Australian earnings have increasingly pulled away from New Zealand over the last decade. Australia's GDP per capita sits around $64,000 compared to New Zealand's $48,000, a 33% gap. That wealth gap translates directly into purchasing power. A hospitality worker in Melbourne can make over double the hourly rate on a weekend than they would in Wellington. Nurses get mandated safety ratios, and outside the city centers, houses are significantly cheaper. Then, in July 2023, the Australian government poured fuel on the fire. They opened a direct, fast-tracked pathway to Australian citizenship exclusively for New Zealanders. Under the Trans-Tasman Travel Agreement, Kiwis could already live and work in Australia indefinitely. But securing permanent residency and citizenship used to be a bureaucratic nightmare. This new policy removed that final hurdle. This policy shift turned a temporary move into a permanent one. What used to be a short overseas experience for young Kiwis to save some cash has become an irreversible life decision, backed by the legal right to stay forever. For Australia, this arrangement is a massive financial win. They acquire a fully trained workforce that they didn't have to pay to educate. These migrants end up contributing far more in taxes than they ever consume in welfare. They also plug Australia's most severe labor shortages, taking on critical roles in hospitals, construction, hospitality, and massive industrial mining operations. Meanwhile, New Zealand absorbs the total financial loss. The government spends roughly $500,000 training a single medical specialist, only to watch that entire investment board a flight to Sydney. The New Zealand government has tried to stop the bleeding. They've introduced rural incentive payments and graduate bonding schemes, requiring newly qualified professionals to stay in the country for a few years. Nothing has reversed the trend. This is a case of asymmetric vulnerability. When two unequal economies share a completely open border and a joint labor market, resources will naturally and continuously siphon from the weaker nation into the stronger one. Breathtaking natural beauty cannot compensate for a struggling domestic economy. Until New Zealand addresses its productivity and its wages, the economic gravity of Australia will continue to pull its future across the sea.